They had almost no one left to build it. By the summer of 1848, nearly every able-bodied man had walked out of town and into the hills, leaving the place a near-silent ruin. They had almost nothing to build it with, on ground that seemed designed to defeat them. Shifting sand, steep and unbuildable hills, a shallow muddy cove where the tide came and went, and beneath all of it, unseen and unsuspected, a fault line that would one day try to take everything back. And yet, in little more than a year, a village of 1,000 people became a city of 25,000. They built it out of the ships rotting in their own harbor. They built it out of the hills they tore down and poured into the sea. This is the story of the most impossible rise of a city ever, a place that willed itself into existence out of sand, water, fire, and abandoned wood. Before the fever came, there was only quiet. The Spanish had reached this bay in 1769 and raised a mission and a fort at the tip of the peninsula in 1776. But for the better part of a century, almost nothing happened here. The wind came off the Pacific and moved the dunes a little each year. The fog rolled in and softened the hills. It was a magnificent harbor attached to a place that history had, so far, forgotten to use. A small settlement gathered on the shore of a shallow crescent of water called Yerba Buena Cove, named for a fragrant herb that grew wild on the slopes. In 1835, a British sea captain set up a trading post there. As late as 1844, the whole place amounted to about a dozen houses and fewer than 50 permanent residents. In 1846, during the war with Mexico, an American naval officer came ashore and raised the flag over the plaza, and no one resisted. The following winter, the town shed its old name and took a new one, borrowed from the bay and the saint. It became San Francisco. By 1848, it held perhaps 1,000 people. It was the largest settlement on the bay, which tells you less about San Francisco than about how empty the bay still was. A muddy, wind-blown outpost of sailors, traders, and dreamers waiting for a reason to matter. The reason arrived in January of 1848, about 130 miles inland, in the cold water of a mill race on the American River. A carpenter named James Marshall saw something glint in the current. It was gold. For a few months, the secret held. Then it broke. And when it broke, it did something strange. It did not build San Francisco. It nearly erased it. The story goes that a merchant named Sam Brannan walked down Montgomery Street holding up a bottle of gold dust and shouting that there was gold on the American River. Whether it happened exactly that way is the kind of thing that hardens into legend. What is certain is the result. The town emptied. Men dropped their tools where they stood. Shopkeepers abandoned their counters. Sailors deserted their ships at anchor. Day after day, small boats crossed the bay loaded with people and their belongings, all of them heading for the diggings. One account from those weeks describes San Francisco as a place forsaken by its own inhabitants, a melancholy solitude, quiet as a town where a plague had passed through. The great rise everyone remembers began, improbably, as an exodus. Before the city could be born, it first had to nearly die. And then the world came for it. When word reached the eastern United States, and the President confirmed it before Congress at the end of that year, the largest voluntary migration the country had ever seen began. They came to be called the 49ers for the year they set out. They came overland across deserts and mountains, and they came by sea around the tip of South America or across the fever swamps of Panama. And nearly all of the sea route ended in the same place. In 1849 alone, something close to 40,000 people stepped off ships and onto the mud of San Francisco. They came from everywhere the news could reach. Before the rush was spent, perhaps 300,000 people would pour into California, roughly half of them by sea, from the eastern states and from Mexico, Chile, Peru, France, Australia, and the ports of China. They arrived certain that the ground was scattered with fortune waiting to be lifted. Most of them were wrong. The easy gold went quickly, and the men who grew rich were more often the ones who sold the shovels and the bread and the whiskey than the ones who swung the pick. But that reckoning came later. For now, they simply kept arriving, tens of thousands of them, each one sure he was the exception, all of them funneling through the same narrow door on the edge of the bay. But the ships that carried them did something no one had planned for. They stayed. A vessel would drop anchor in the cove, and within days its crew would vanish into the hills, chasing the same dream as everyone else. The captain would follow. The ship would sit there, crewless, useless for sailing, swinging on its anchor with no one to take it home. And then another would arrive, and empty, and another. By the late summer of 1849, there were roughly 200 abandoned square riggers in the harbor. Within another year, there were more than 500. Before it was over, more than 800 ships crowded the cove so thickly that people called it a forest of masts, bare poles standing against the sky for as far as the eye could follow. Here was a city drowning in people and starving for everything else. There were almost no workers because the workers were all upriver. Building materials were scarce and ruinously expensive, shipped from Oregon and around the world to a place that made almost nothing of its own. And the ground itself refused to cooperate. Dunes that swallowed foundations, hills too steep to climb, a cove too shallow to dock in and too wet to build on. So the city looked out at its harbor, at the hundreds of dead ships going soft in the salt water, and it found its answer floating right in front of it. They hauled the ships ashore. They ran them aground in the shallows, drove them into the mud, built wharves out around them, and put them to work on dry land. A ship became a warehouse. A ship became a hotel. A ship became a saloon, a shop, a church, a jail. The abandoned fleet that had carried the dreamers in was dismantled and rebuilt into the town they now needed. The most famous of them was a former whaler called the Niantic. They beached her, cut a door into her hull, and turned her into a storehouse and lodging house. Above that door, someone painted a line that reads now like an epitaph for the whole restless age: rest for the weary and storage for trunks. There was the Euphemia, a small prison brig. The very first money the town council ever set aside was spent to buy her, because a city this lawless needed somewhere to put the men it arrested. She became San Francisco's first real jail, and soon its first asylum as well, holding the criminal and the broken and the lost all together in her hold. There was the Apollo, another storeship, whose bones lie today beneath the Federal Reserve Bank. There was the General Harrison, buried and forgotten and dug up again a century and a half later. By the summer of 1852, a single newspaper listed 164 storeships by name along the waterfront, a whole economy afloat in the mud. And then, the city found a way to turn the ships into something even stranger than buildings. It turned them into land. Speculators had begun buying water lots, plots of the cove that were still underwater, gambling that the shoreline would one day reach them. And it did, because they made it reach them. A ship would be deliberately sunk on a lot to hold the claim, and then the space around it filled in, and the owner would step out of the bay and onto ground that had not existed the year before. The harbor was being converted, plank by plank and hull by hull, into real estate. If you are finding this story worth your time, consider subscribing. This channel exists to give American cities the weight and the memory they deserve, because the story was about to get darker before it got greater. A city built of dry timber, tarred rope, canvas, and beached wooden ships, packed tight and lit by open flame, is a city waiting to burn. And San Francisco burned, not once. Over roughly 18 months, beginning on Christmas Eve of 1849, 6 great fires swept through the town, one after another. The first started in a gambling house near the Central Plaza and took some 50 buildings with it. The worst came in early May of 1851. It broke out near the same square, caught the wind, ran along the raised wooden sidewalks that the city had laid over its muddy streets, and burned for about 10 hours. When it finally reached the water and stopped, it had destroyed something like 2,000 buildings. Roughly three-quarters of San Francisco was gone. The Niantic burned to the waterline. The dream lodged in her hull went up with everything else. After a while, the fires stopped feeling like accidents. Each one staggered the confidence of the merchants a little more, until a moody conviction settled over the waterfront that the place was simply cursed, that this city had been built too fast and too greedily and was never meant to last. Some of the fires were almost certainly set on purpose by men who profited from the panic and the rebuilding. A town made of tinder, full of strangers who had crossed the world for money, was a town with no shortage of reasons to burn. And what it did next tells you what kind of place this had become. It rebuilt every single time. After some fires, the city put up a fifth of what it had lost in 10 days. The ashes were still warm and the hammers were already going. It burned 6 times in a year and a half, and 6 times it came back, until the people who lived there began to speak of their town as something that could not be killed. Decades later, the city would make that idea official and put a phoenix on its seal, the bird that rises from its own ashes. By then, it had earned the symbol many times over. But rebuilding on top of the ruins was not enough. The city was still hemmed in by the same impossible geography that had nearly beaten it at the start, with too little flat land, too much water, and too many hills to ever spread the way its ambition demanded. So San Francisco did the only thing left to a place with more ambition than ground. It rebuilt the earth itself. They went after the dunes and the hills with everything they had. In 1852, a great steam shovel arrived, a machine they nicknamed the Steam Paddy because it was said to do the work of 20 laborers at a stroke. Day and night it tore into the sand hills and loaded the sand into rail cars that ran on temporary tracks down to the water, where it was dumped into Yerba Buena Cove. Hill by hill, they fed the high ground into the low water. They filled the cove with sand, with rubble, with the ash and debris of all those fires, and with the drowned hulls of the ships themselves. The shoreline crept outward, then lurched, then vanished. Montgomery Street, which had been the beach where the tide came in, ended up blocks inland. The Niantic's old lot, once at the water's edge, sat 3 streets back from the bay. The cove that had defined the town for a century was simply gone, paved and built over, and beneath the new streets lay the sand of leveled hills, and scattered through it the remains of 40 to 60 ships, a buried fleet holding up a city. In little more than 3 years, 1,000 people had become tens of thousands, and a village had become one of the great ports of the world. By all the measures that matter, San Francisco had won. It had beaten the emptiness, beaten the fires, beaten the sand and the sea. It had taken the most hostile ground imaginable and simply overpowered it. There was only one enemy it had not beaten because it did not know that the enemy was there. All of this, the filled cove, the leveled dunes, the buried ships, the towers going up on manufactured ground, sat astride a crack in the earth that no one had a name for yet. The great fault that runs the length of the peninsula would not be identified and named until 1895 by a single geologist studying the landforms, and even he did not understand what it could do. Almost no one else knew it was there at all. Nobody yet understood that the ground could move. For half a century, the city built in that ignorance, and the ignorance held. And then, on the morning of the 18th of April, 1906, the fault let go. Nearly 300 miles of the earth ripped in an instant, and the shock reached the peninsula in a magnitude close to 7.9. In the older parts of the city, the ground held reasonably well because it was rock and hill. But in the places the city had made, the filled cove, the reclaimed marsh, the soft ground poured over the drowned ships. The earth behaved like water. It shook hardest and longest exactly where San Francisco had manufactured its own foundation. The made land betrayed the men who made it. The building that stood on the Niantic's hull came down. And then, as it always had, the city caught fire, and the flames finished what the shaking had begun. The lesson was written into the ground itself, and the ground would repeat it. When the scientists later mapped where the shaking had been worst, the map traced the old vanished cove almost exactly. And 83 years afterward, when the earth moved again in 1989, it was those same made neighborhoods, the filled marsh and the reclaimed shore, that shuddered and broke and burned once more for exactly the same reason. The city keeps forgetting what it is built on. The earth keeps reminding it. It was the greatest catastrophe in the city's history, and it was, in a way, San Franciscans already understood in their bones, simply the seventh great fire. So they did the thing they had always done. Before the embers were cold, one engineer wrote that the people seemed determined to begin at once to rebuild a new San Francisco. And they did. Walk the financial district today, and you are walking on a lie the city told the sea and made come true. The towers rest on sand that was once a hill somewhere else, and on the bones of ships whose crews ran off to look for gold and never came back for them. Now and then a construction crew digs down and strikes old timber and lifts out a piece of a hull, and once, famously, found bottles of champagne still sealed in the dark where a store ship had waited more than 100 years to be remembered. One ship came back to the light in the 1970s beneath a downtown building site. Another was struck in the 1990s by crews boring a tunnel for the trains. And when they uncovered the old General Harrison, they measured her and photographed her and studied her bones. And then they covered her over again and raised a hotel on the spot, and she went back to waiting. The fleet never really leaves. It only surfaces, every so often, just long enough to remind the living what the whole gleaming city is standing on. That is what San Francisco is. Not a city that was placed on good ground, but a city that refused the ground it was given and built its own, out of wreckage and sand and sheer will, over a fault that has not finished with it and never signed any agreement to stop. The most impossible rise of a city ever was never really finished. It was only, for now, still standing. If you want to keep sitting with the weight of how American cities were really made, subscribe and stay with this channel.